In the year since Owl House began, it has rapidly climbed its way to the position of one of the most popular cartoons airing right now, and over the next few years will likely continue to sit as one of the biggest animated series out there. So the question is, how is it? And if you want the short answer, then it's good but has a lot of problems. And if you want the longer answer, then let's get into it, starting with the aspects of the show that I think are its strongest qualities. The art in this show is really well done. From the bizarre skyline of Bonesborough to the beautiful image of the Isles from up above, the background artists in this show do an amazing job of selling both the strangeness and the wonder of this setting. The character and monster designers are also successful in their role. Monsters are cool looking, such as the Slither Beast with its eyes located on its gums. Various people of the Boiling Isles have neat designs that make them stand out. One of my favorites being Kikimura, whose hair looks like a clawed hand grabbing onto her head, and her clothing obscuring her mouth accentuates her hair further. Outside of looking cool, they also do a good job of having designs tell us things about who the characters are. Take, for instance, Amity. Her aquamarine hair stands out from the rest of the cast and reflects her status as an elite. However, we can see by looking at her roots that this is not her natural hair color, and this character design detail is a great way to represent who Amity is as a character. She is someone putting on the act of an elite, highly skilled witch from a prominent family, but in reality, she is seemingly the black sheep of her siblings, pressured to live up to the family legacy, forced to dye her hair to better match her siblings and mother, and struggling to be good enough for her parents. And that's a connection that we can make based on a single detail of her design. The show also looks great in motion with some really smooth looking animations. There are a lot of nice little pieces of character animation scattered throughout, along with some grand scenes where the animation quality kicks into next gear, such as the two fights between Ida and Lilith and the Grom dance sequence, with all three of these moments probably being the most memorable in the series. Both the opening and outro of the show are excellent. The opening has a nice energy to it and a fantastic tracking shot near the end. Meanwhile, the outro is calm, with Luz walking along to the beat of the music as the environment shifts around her as she has different reactions to the world she now finds herself in. All in all, the artists and animators on this show did a great job. Ida is by far my favorite character in the show. I love her anti-authoritarian attitude and her resolve to not conform to the unfair standards of society. She is proud of who she is, and even if her decisions have made her live a less than glamorous lifestyle, she is fine with that and simply wants to live her own life. Despite the Emperor's Coven potentially offering her a cure for her curse and her only opportunity to legally practice all types of magic, she refuses to sacrifice her freedom and individuality, even if that means she might be doomed to succumb to her affliction. However, she isn't a perfect person by any means. She has no issues with the idea of cheating, she is a self-proclaimed scammer, and despite her status as one of the most powerful witches in the Boiling Isles, she isn't above screwing up and dropping her staff in the middle of a fight. These qualities help make her an endearing member of the Bad Girl Coven, but underneath it all is an admirable person who struggles against adversity and would sacrifice everything to protect the people she cares about. And this makes her the perfect mentor to a character like Luz, who also came from an environment that shunned her and wanted to make her conform, by showing that she can stand up against those pressures and be the person that she wants to be. And I feel that the relationship between these two is the emotional and thematic core of the story. And this is the point that I unfortunately have to get to my criticisms. The story of Owl House a lot of the time feels like a confused Uber driver taking half an hour to get somewhere that's supposed to be 10 minutes away. The show feels like it's treading water by reusing similar episode ideas over and over instead of focusing on aspects of the show that should be more prominent. A big example of this is the number of instances where the conflict of either the A plot or B plot is the bad guy tricks one of the main characters and scams them. There are 5 different times in the first season that this happens, including 2 of them being done by the same character across 2 different episodes. And while this might not seem like too big a deal, stuff like this adds up to making the story feel weighed down by extra unnecessary stories that are too samey and don't really add anything to the overall enjoyment of the show. This is time that could be spent on things that actually matter to the plot, such as Luz learning magic. The main goal of the story, which is established right in the first episode, is Luz needs to learn magic to become a witch. Yet despite this, she spends a large chunk of the story not moving towards this goal whatsoever. She learns her first spell in episode 4, but it takes an entire 8 more episodes for Luz to finally learn a second spell. That's like 40% of the runtime of the show without any progress in her actually learning magic. Instead, the show wastes its time on riveting stories like Luz and King write a book. When I first heard that Owl House was going to be structured into 22-minute episodes instead of 11-minute segments, I was happy to hear that. A lot of shows could benefit from longer episode runtimes, such as Steven Universe, which unfortunately had to settle for 11 minutes with occasional multi-part specials. After having watched the first season, however, I honestly feel like the show would have benefited from an 11-minute structure. There are many episodes where the main plot could have easily been altered to fit 11 minutes. A good example of this is the episode Once Upon a Swap, which was a fun enough story, but giving a whole episode to it felt like overkill when there are so many more important things to focus on. If the series had an 11-minute structure, it might have left more room for episodes to focus on these important things while still doing stuff like a fun little body swap episode. Instead, the show often feels like it really doesn't have its priorities straight and wastes a lot of its runtime. One of the most important parts of a story like this, where a character is whisked away from their normal life to a fantasy world, is the world itself. And while I praise the depiction of the Boiling Isles from a visual standpoint, the writing of the setting makes it feel barely explored and very inconsistent. So much of the show's time is spent in only a small handful of locations, Bonesborough, the Owl House, or Hexside, when there is so much more to go out and see. By limiting this setting to mostly these same environments, the series holds back the potential of this world to grow into a more expanded and interesting one. As of right now, it still feels like we're just dipping our toes in this setting instead of really jumping in and getting to know more about it. Then there are the strange inconsistencies in the world building. Take, for instance, how Ida is connected to the Boiling Isles. She is the most wanted witch there, seemingly by far, but instead of constantly being in hiding, she runs a booth at a marketplace completely out in the open, and if she's ever worried about anyone recognizing her, she just puts her hood up. This is like if Bin Laden sold fake purses on a sidewalk in Manhattan, and every time the cops came by, he put on a pair of sunglasses. There is a total disconnect between how the world seemingly should interact with Ida and how it actually does, making her feel nowhere near as big a deal in this world as she should be. At the very least, they could have had her use her magic to hide her identity, which would have better sold told how Ida has to avoid the Emperor's Coven while making Ida seem like a more resourceful witch in the process. Instead, the Emperor's Coven just feels incompetent, not being able to catch somebody who is operating in broad daylight. In general, the influence of the Emperor and his coven fluctuates. In one scene in the penultimate episode, it seems that the Emperor has such a strong influence over the people of the Boiling Isles that even a character as nice as Willow seemingly admires him and says that he taught them how to do magic the right way. But at the same time, when Luz joins Hexside, she gets to learn more than one type of magic and everybody just rolls with it. It doesn't matter that nobody since the Emperor took over has been able to learn multiple magic tracks, and that the punishment for not eventually joining a coven is being turned to stone. Nobody is bothered by this whatsoever. If even somebody like Willow has been fed enough propaganda to believe that the coven system is the right way, why does this never form any kind of conflict between them? Why don't even bully characters like Basha seem to confront her about it? Instead, the influence of the Emperor feels convenient to the story instead of consistent to the world, and that is not good world building. I want to ask you all a simple question. What is the Owl House about? Based on descriptions of the show and the content of its intro and outro, you'd think that it was about a teenage girl finding herself in another world and becoming a witch's apprentice while going on adventures with her mentor and a cute demon, and you'd be wrong. As mentioned earlier, Luz barely learns any magic for the first half of the season, with Ida not really seeming like a mentor to Luz much at all. And then around the halfway point, it feels like the series gives up and decides to have Luz sent to Hexside. The decision halfway through the first season to suddenly enroll Luz at Hexside felt like a sharp 90-degree turn for the show's narrative. In the first episode the school is introduced, Luz is immediately banned, which makes the audience assume that this is a dead end, and reinforces the idea that Ida is going to be Luz's mentor, only for them to go back on it after a few episodes. What was seemingly supposed to be a fantasy adventure series about a girl learning magic from a powerful witch turns into yet another high school series. By having Luz study at Hexside, it ends up turning the location into our default main setting, since it's the place our main character spends 5 days a week, and serves as the main place where she can pursue her goal. This means the Owl House, the place that the show is named after, and the rest of the Boiling Isles ends up falling into the background, which helps contribute to the previously mentioned issue of the Owl House's world building, that we don't explore the world nearly as much as we should. And along with the Owl House and the rest of the Boiling Isles, Ida and King feel like they end up losing relevance. After Luz officially joins Hexside, Ida mostly ends up either in B-plots or having very minor involvement in the main plot of an episode. Ida is especially hurt by this writing decision because the drama that comes from the events of the last 2 episodes stems from the relationship between her and Luz. But most of the episodes heading up to those final 2 episodes are focused on Luz and her friends at Hexside. Imagine if a show like Amphibia did something like this, where halfway through the first season Anne suddenly has to start going to frog school and befriends a bunch of frog teenagers that she spends a huge chunk of time with, taking her away from the Planters. It would have been a much worse show as a result, because so much of the show is built around the familial bond between Anne and the Planters, and I feel that show did a much better job of focusing on that than the Owl House did with Luz, Ida, and King. It's not even like making it a magic high school makes it more unique, since even that is a concept that has been done many times before, with the show itself making multiple Harry Potter references. is. If you really want to watch a show about a magic school, you're much better off with Little Witch Academia, a story that is actually built around the concept and does a great job with it instead of Owl House that just converts itself into one partway through. And the decision to have Luz go to school clashes with the genre and themes of the story. Part of the fun of a fantasy story is often getting away from the real-life concepts associated with boredom, such as school. Obviously, not all fantasy has to do this, but if you are going to make it reflect real life, it should at least be interesting. Hexside just feels like a high school with a magic paint job. Lockers and school bells might be monster versions, but they are still lockers and school bells. Aesthetically, it really isn't that much different from a normal high school, except they aren't learning that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell for the 10th time. Thematically, having Luz go there feels incredibly counterintuitive. A big theme of the story is individuality versus conformity, and how Luz escapes a world that is trying to make her conform to go to a world where she can actually attempt to be the kind of person she wants to be. By having her go to another school that also tries to make its students conform, it just feels like an awkward direction to take the story based on the themes established in the first episode. It takes us away from the thematically stable pairing of Ida and Luz as a mentor and apprentice to something that just doesn't feel appropriate for the story they at least seem to be trying to tell. Also, before we get to the next section, can I just say, it feels like Luz's Hexside friend, Gus, doesn't really have a purpose as a character. He shares a lot of similarities to King, both are largely comedic relief characters, both are supposed to be the cute little guy, and both are trying to compensate for that by having influence over others. They aren't exactly the same character, but they share enough similarities that it makes Gus feel a lot like the other guy of the main cast when everyone else has more things that make them stand out as characters. Altogether, I'm just not really a fan of the Hexside aspect of the story. Luz's growth as a witch over the course of the story goes from painfully slow to overwhelmingly fast. As said before, there are 8 entire episodes between Luz learning her first spell and her learning her second. It takes so long for Luz to actually make any progress at becoming a witch at first, but once she is at Hexside, it's the exact opposite problem. Some of the major moments of the story up to this point are Luz learning new spells, with the previous 2 episodes where she learned the spells being largely focused on these discoveries and has them be the solution to the conflict of those episodes. Although these moments are too distant from each other, at the very least they are treated with importance, which makes Luz learning magic feel special. However, for Luz's third spell, it is learned casually right at the beginning of an episode, which is very underwhelming compared to the previous spells. And while it is used to defeat Grom at the end of the episode, it doesn't feel as well woven into the narrative of the episode, with much more emphasis being placed on Luz's relationship with Amity than Luz using a new spell. And then the fourth spell is even more casually introduced, with a blink and you'd miss it scene of Luz extracting the glyph off of one of Basha's Grudgeby balls. As the series goes on, Luz's discovery of new spells feels less and less significant. On top of this, when we see her use these spells in a fight, she seemingly goes from having no idea how to do much more than surprise people with a light spell or lure something into an ice trap, to suddenly effectively wielding this magic in combat. This gets really ridiculous in the series finale, where she is suddenly overwhelming the Warden, who 1v1'd Ida at the beginning of the show, tears through the Emperor's guards, fights Lilith, and even battles Emperor Belos himself. And yes, it's obvious that Lilith and Belos were both holding back, and the one hit that Luz got in on Belos was a surprise attack. But there is a huge disconnect between how competent in a fight she was before and how competent she is now. The show is content with just letting the audience assume she got that good off screen instead of actually showing us, or at least describing to us, the kind of training she went through to learn how to use glyphs like this. This kind of storytelling is really unsatisfying, because part of the appeal of a story like this is seeing the main character learn how to do the thing they want to do. By cutting out her actual training almost entirely and just showing us the results of it, it deprives the audience of actually getting to see the characters grow by instead just fast forwarding us to the end results. And all of this is done to just quickly move along Luz's progress as a witch after having her spend so much time not actually doing magic for so much of the first season. They should have structured her improvement over the course of the series much more evenly, with her learning new spells at a better pace and spending more time actually learning how to use them effectively. Ida, over the course of the series, is presented as Luz's mentor, but barely teaches her anything about magic. At the very least, they could have had a scene of her sparring with her, and that could have explained how she started to get so good at using magic, while also giving Ida something to actually do in relation to her being Luz's mentor. Also, as mentioned earlier, Luz is allowed to study every track at Hexside, even though this is something that has never been done and goes completely against how magic is taught in a very rigid manner to reflect the Coven system. But the story bends over backwards so that Luz can both go to this magic school and still learn everything. This just reveals more of how awkward having Luz sign up for Hexside is, because if they just committed to Luz learning magic with Ida, then they never would have had to have such a weird dismissal of the show's world building. Amity's character arc in Owl House is very rushed. When we are first introduced to her, she is a blatant bully who picks on Willow, insults Luz, and steps on King's cupcake just for the sake of being a jerk. We then see her go from this to her being friends with Luz in a very short span of time, and it feels like a lot of her characterization as a bully just gets thrown away, despite the fact that she clearly has more to improve on as a person. In understanding Willow, she burns Willow's memory of them as kids because she doesn't want to be associated with her, and later on in the episode it's revealed the reason that she broke off their friendship as kids is because she was pressured to do so by her family that would have sabotaged Willow getting into Hexside. While that makes us understand why she did what she did back then, the problem is that it still doesn't justify or explain why she felt the need to go after Willow as a bully. In the first scene we are introduced to her, she bullies Willow in private with absolutely nobody else around. She wasn't pressured into it by her parents, she wasn't trying to impress her friends, she was doing it purely because she wanted to bully Willow, because she is a bully. And this episode doesn't do enough to address that issue with Amity. Instead, they are content enough to give a sad explanation as to why Amity did a thing long before the actual events of the story, and then sweep her recent actions under the rug. And then just 2 episodes later, she has apparently improved so much as a person that she confronts Basha and says, "I used to be like you, Basha, obsessed with status, challenging my competition, but I grew up. When will you?" Let me reiterate, she was so scared of being associated with Willow that she burned Willow's memory of her just 2 episodes ago, with the episode in between dealing more with Amity's relationship with Luz than her overcoming her obsession with status. She talks like she's undergone this huge character arc when she really hasn't. Part of the reason why I think Amity's arc was so rushed is simply that they prioritized setting up her and Luz's romance over her own arc. Trying to set up a romantic relationship between our plucky main character and our cold bully character would have been an awkward thing to set up early on, so they just quickly shift Amity from a bully to a good guy as quickly as possible so that everyone can get on board with their relationship. I'm not against the two of them getting together because I think their dynamic is actually pretty cute. Luz's warm friendliness breaking through Amity's icy exterior is a pretty good setup for a nice romance. It's also sort of nice to see their future romantic relationship be officially set up in the first season, with the confirmation that Amity has a crush on Luz. Most shows feel like they wait until they are deep into the show to reveal that, especially when it comes to LGBT characters, so it is a little refreshing to see that. However, I still don't feel like doing this was worth sacrificing Amity having a better character arc. The characters in a relationship should be prioritized over the relationship itself, and by putting shipping Amity with Luz over Amity herself, they are making a big mistake when it comes to character writing. Please do not have another Starco situation where the show becomes obsessed with its shipping instead of focusing on the story and characters themselves. I feel that Amity's arc should have been spread out and extended into the second season so that her eventual growth would have felt a lot more satisfying. Instead, she is quickly rushed from a bully to someone who can't stop dropping her spaghetti around her crush. To highlight how I think this show could have handled itself a lot better, I want to point to the episode that I think is quote-unquote the best episode of Owl House. And by that, I don't mean the obvious choice of Agony of a Witch. That episode is easily the best of the series, and many people will agree with me on that assessment. The fight between Ida and Lilith is the best scene in the series, with nothing coming anywhere close. A brilliantly animated confrontation that heightened the drama of the series and felt like the point where the plot finally went to the next level. The episode I am talking about is Adventures in Elements, which, although it doesn't reach the dramatic storytelling and gorgeous animation of Agony of a Witch, I think it best represents what I wish the show did more of. It adds to the world building of the show by taking us to a new scenic location with the knee. It's a respite from the setting constantly being either Bonesboro, the Owl House, or Hexside, a beautiful snow-covered environment that takes advantage of the fact that the Boiling Isle sits on the remains of a titan by having us venture to one of its body parts, selling the sheer scale of how large this being once was. It's an episode that actually focuses on Luz learning magic, something that the show doesn't do nearly enough of. And on top of that, it's one of the few times that Ida actually feels like a mentor to Luz, teaching her about the world and giving her advice that allows her to learn the spell she needs to use to save the day in the end. And although I still wasn't a fan of the fact that by this point in the story, Luz and Amity were pretty much 100% friends, it actually gives us insight into Amity and how, despite how she presents herself as a skilled witch, she still feels like she needs to rely on a practice wand, which is a nice extra piece of characterization for her. This is the Owl House I want to see. The Owl House where Luz is actually taught magic by Ida. The Owl House where we get to explore this beautiful world and see what it has to offer. The Owl House where Agony of a Witch is an even better episode because the lead up of building up the relationship between these two characters makes the emotional payoff of that episode stronger. If that was what the Owl House actually was, it would be a much better show. After all of that, you might think I hate this show or something, but I really don't. In spite of its issues, it was a show that I'd look forward to whenever a new episode dropped. My very critical opinion of it comes from a place of wishing the show would find its priorities and better live up to its potential. And while it's already lost a lot of opportunities, there is still room for the show to grow. Based on comments from creator Dana Terrace, she says that the second season will be more like the final 2 episodes of season 1, which means it will probably be darker and more story-driven. If that's the case, I hope it works out for the show. I want it to succeed, and I want it to learn from the mistakes of its first season. If it can do that, I will be happy. But until then, I wait cautiously excited for the future. Hello everyone, just want to say thank you for watching the video, and I'm sorry it took a while, but I sort of became obsessed with the video game Kenshi for the entire month of January. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again in the future.